Robert Falcon Scott, or Captain Scott as most people call him, was a famous British explorer who lived at the start of the 20th century. In 1910, he set out on a new expedition. His aim was to get to the South Pole. At that time, nobody knew very much about Antarctica. The maps were not good, and nobody had ever been to the South Pole. Scott wanted to be the first. There were 16 men in Scott's expedition, and they were divided into groups. In October 1911, one group set off with 2 motor sledges carrying supplies, but both motor sledges broke down. The men had to pull the supplies across the snow themselves. This was exhausting, and the rest of the expedition soon caught up with them. Then, a snowstorm began, and temperatures dropped. It was impossible to continue the expedition while the weather was so bad, so the men camped and waited. Scott was determined to reach the South Pole. He decided exactly who was going to make the final part of the journey, himself and 4 others. This part of the journey went well, but when they reached their destination, they found a tent, some supplies, and a letter. A Norwegian explorer called Amundsen had got to the pole first. Using skis, Amundsen had travelled much faster. It was a terrible moment for Scott. In his diary, he wrote, "Great God, this is an awful place." Captain Scott and the 4 other men turned around and headed back to base camp the next day. The return journey was a disaster. The weather was terrible, and the men were exhausted. They did not have enough food to eat, and on the 17th of February, one of them collapsed and died. The 4 survivors continued their journey, hoping for better weather. But in fact, the weather got worse, much worse, and they had to stop. One of the group, Captain Oates, decided on the 17th of March that he had no hope of completing the journey. He went out of the tent saying, "I am just going outside, and I may be some time." He did not return. He must have decided that his own death would help the other 3, because they would have more food. Unfortunately, the death of Captain Oates was not enough to save the others. They were only 18 kilometres from new supplies, but the weather was so bad they could not continue. The final entry in Scott's diary shows that they had given up. He wrote, "I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more." 6 months later, a search party came across the bodies of Scott and the 2 other men in their tent. The body of Captain Oates was never found.